Hello, good evening from wherever you are, fellow Zimbabweans. This is Dr. Noah Manyika of the Build Zimbabwe Alliance. We are going to be together for the next hour. I will start off like I did last week by sharing some thoughts, and then I will proceed to answer your questions. The history of most African nations since the beginning of the decolonization process over 50 years ago has been of electing leaders who have the capacity to excite people about change, even when they don't have the capacity to deliver the promises they make. Those two things are different. And at any moment in the life of a nation, particularly one which is as historic as this one, we have to ask these two questions. Obviously, it's important for us to get excited, to be stirred up, so that we can be part of the process of change. But the most important thing is that the leaders who excite us must have the capacity to deliver the promises they make. So again, I want to bring your attention to the history of Africa. We have had several changes of government, and a lot of times we reduce our struggle to just changing governments or changing leaders. We don't go to the extent of understanding that the previous governments built a certain culture of leadership, which is one of the reasons why we end up in trouble. They built bureaucracies as well, which have impeded the tempo that we are supposed to set, the economic tempo that delivers on the promises that these very same politicians make. And one of the things that you're going to hear saying over and over is the Build Zimbabwe Alliance is that it's very critical for us to have top to bottom leadership renewal in Zimbabwe, because it's one thing to change the president, and we can all get excited about a particular candidate, and we can think that if we put a great president there, then all our problems are over. But the reality is that a great president must work with great MPs, must have a great bureaucracy that actually delivers on the things that are turned from public policy into tangible things that are supposed to impact the lives of the people. So, it's very, very critical at election time, when we get to a time such as this, that we ask ourselves this question: are those leaders that excite us, do they have the capacity to deliver on the change that they promise? Do they have that capacity? And part of the problem as well, because the capacity also depends on the kind of political formation that they belong to. I've said from the beginning that one thing that must happen, even as we fight against the current system and so on, is that even those parties that are in the opposition must actually reform their own structures and their own culture, because there is something about the structures and the culture of political parties in general that produces bad leaders. And one of the reasons why they produce bad leaders is because, even if you have a great candidate for the presidency, then you're going to have this situation where the people who end up being candidates for parliament, candidates for council, are the people who are party loyalists. It has nothing to do with competency, as it were, but the questions that are asked is, how long have you served in party structures? And so on. And unless you have, and it doesn't matter what you bring to the table, unless you have actually served in party structures and so on, you don't qualify for leadership. So you can end up with a great president and absolutely useless MPs. You can end up with a great president and absolutely useless people as councillors. So it doesn't matter what promises this presidential candidate makes, unless their political party is able to bring in people who are competent to then be translated into the staffing for government or councillors and so on. You can make whatever promises you want, you won't be able to deliver. So let me say this, let me make this point again. The history of most African nations since the beginning of the decolonization process, over 50 years ago, has been of electing leaders who have the capacity to excite people about change, even when they don't have the capacity to deliver the promises they make. And one of the things that you're going to hear over and over again as we approach this election is the promise that we will create jobs. You know, people will say, yeah, you know, we're going to create this many jobs. And people get excited because, and they say, you know what, let's vote for the party that promises to be able to create the most jobs. But the question is not asked, how are you going to create those jobs? How exactly are you going to make sure you create those jobs? Now, let's ask ourselves this question. How are jobs created? Who creates those jobs? So one of the things that I watched recently, I'm not sure if I mentioned this the last time, but it was a brilliant documentary about Rio Tinto in Perth, in Western Australia, where they've automated a lot of things that they do at this mine, including truck driving. So these trucks that they have do not have drivers. And then they've gone on to as well to automate the rigs that actually do the drilling. And the reason why they do that is because companies are harnessing technology to increase productivity. That's normal. If you actually want to have a positive impact on your bottom line, you reduce costs. And the way that you reduce costs is by using technology in your production process. And when you introduce technology into your production process, what that means is that you actually employ less people, even though you are making more money and you are being more productive. So here's the question. We are where we are today with 90% unemployment, and politicians can come to you and promise you that they are going to create this many jobs. And the way that they're going to create this many jobs, according to some, is, yeah, we are going to simply invite companies to come here. And when they come here, they're going to open all these businesses and all of that. But remember, when they come in, they want to make money. And in the 21st century, they will want to use technology to increase productivity. So they are not going to create as many jobs as they did before technology got where it did. So, you know, for us as a country that looks at unemployment as something that is a very, very critical problem, you can promise to create many, many jobs. But the question is how. And here is the letdown that is going to be there. We're going to open up, people are going to come in, they're going to be, you know, mining, and they're going to be doing all kinds of things, they're going to set up industries and so on, and we realize, wow, even though they're creating all these industries, they are not creating as many jobs as we need. So again, let's go to the beginning. What did I say? I said the biggest problem in Africa is electing leaders with the capacity to excite us about change, even when they don't have the capacity to deliver the promises they make. So, you know, these are some of the tough questions that we need to ask. Politicians will tell us they're going to create millions and millions of jobs, particularly in the 21st century. One of the things that we must be very, very careful of is, you know, making 20th century promises in the 21st century. And one of the challenges of leadership in the 21st century is dealing with 20th century expectations in the 21st century. People are going to have the expectations, you know, that are from way back. You know, how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with the expectation that you actually, as a government, create jobs, when in fact, when you look at what is happening now, there is less and less focus on the government as a job creator, because you know, a lot of times when the government creates jobs, there's so many inefficiencies as a result. And there's a lot of focus on encouraging the private sector to create jobs and the government to create the environment where the private sector can actually do this. So, you know, if somebody says, I'm going to be president and I am going to create jobs, what exactly do they mean? But we must also ask, you know, going forward, is this: who really creates jobs in fact, the kind of entrepreneurs that are creating industries that create jobs? Who are they? You know, and are those people going to be brought in to Zimbabwe, and how? How are we going to encourage these new job creators to actually be part of our economy? So, you know, there are no easy answers as far as that is concerned, but you owe it to yourself as a Zimbabwean to make sure that you ask these questions of those people that you're going to elect. So dealing with 20th century expectations in the 21st century is going to be a very, very serious challenge. There are even some people who are going to assume that you know, when you come into office, you're simply going to turn on the burners at industries that were closed. And I said this before, this is the tragedy of our country. Some of the industries that are closed are never going to come back on stream. They're not. Because what has happened, unfortunately, is that production processes have changed. We are in a totally new environment and new technologies and so on, and it may not be cost effective to actually restart something which was changed. So this is where then it becomes very, very critical for you as an economy to attract or to really incentivize the new job creators. Who are the new job creators? And we have to identify those. And unfortunately, a lot of times we even look down on some of the things that Zimbabweans are doing right now. We look at them and we call them artisanal. We look at them, and because they're in the informal sector, we don't think they're important. But the truth of the matter is that all those things that people are doing are actually taking care of their needs. All those things, and what they need, you know, in the case of the informal sector, is help with formalization, help with actual access to more capital, help with making sure that they can bring in their technologies into the things that they are doing and do certain things better. And these people, a lot of them indigenous people, are the job creators. You know, these are the people who will actually build the next kind of industry and so on. And they're here. You know, they're not outside, they're here. And what we need to do is to facilitate the partnership of these people who are already working hard and who, unfortunately, a lot of times we actually do not really value, and make sure that these people get the support that they need. So it's very, very critical for us to have a very honest conversation about all of this. So, you know, promising change simply because we have resources is not enough, because there are many countries that are rich in resources that are very poor and self-governing. So if we go back, we actually thought that self-government was the answer to all our problems. We thought that majority rule, you know, that's the answer to all of our problems. Since we've got the gold, we've got the diamonds, we've got the platinum, we've got the lithium, we've got the great land, we've got all these things that other nations do not have. We are richly endowed as a country. But again, promising change simply because we have resources is not enough, because there are many countries, and the Congo is a case in point, that are very, very wealthy in natural resources, but you know, they're very, very poor. So what is the most important weapon in our war on poverty? Is it the resources that we have, or the type of leadership we elect? And you and I, if we refuse to learn from history, we do so at our own peril. Because what has been proven in Africa is that it's not the resources that are the critical factor in fighting and winning the war on poverty. It is the type of leadership that you have, what that leadership is going to do with those resources, the capacity of that leadership to turn those resources into the capital that we need to really impact the well-being of our people. So, we can talk about this, and I've heard this on many platforms. We can do great because we have many resources. Now, remember, there are some countries which are not as well resourced as we are. I've mentioned this before. Israel is 65% desert, and yet it is one of the exporters of food, almost self-sufficient in food. How does that happen in a country which is almost 65% desert? Because, the thing about it is that you end up with leaders who say, well, we don't have resources, so we really need to create our own competitive advantage. And they go the extra mile to create that competitive advantage, and all of a sudden, you know what, they're doing better than countries with, a lot of resources. Countries with a lot of natural resources, unfortunately, there's a lot of distortion that happens. And others who are outside have a vested interest in making sure that the leaders who end up in control of those resources are leaders they can manipulate. So, what ends up happening is, somebody comes in and you're very excited about this person taking over from some of the liberation parties, and they say, this is change. This is change. They come in and they continue mortgaging the resources of the country to others, or they're so beholden to foreign interests that the exploitation of those resources never really benefit the people of the country. So there's a lot of distortion that happens as a result of resources. And this has been called the resource curse. And most of the African countries actually experience this. The most important weapon we have in the war on poverty are not the natural resources we have, is the type of leaders we elect. Now, when you elect a president, when you elect MPs who eventually become cabinet ministers, what you must never forget is that the president and his cabinet play a very, very critical role in appointing people who serve under them, the people who actually populate what we call the bureaucracy, the people who run our parastatals, and so on. And here is the danger. If you don't elect the right people, they will simply continue the culture that we have seen here in Zimbabwe of leaders choosing people who will be protectors of their own political interests. And in exchange, these people are never going to be held responsible for non-performance. And what we need right now going forward are leaders who are committed to appointing people who will perform, competent people who will perform. And where do you find those competent people who will perform? Now, unfortunately, you rarely find those kinds of people in the partisan political pools from which we draw people that are appointed into the bureaucracy and all of that. And going forward, we must make sure that the people that we elect are not so partisan in their thinking that they can actually appoint people who don't belong to their political party as long as they are competent and effective. And unfortunately, the culture that we have right now, the political formations that we have now, it's very doubtful that we are going to have that kind of people elected into parliament and even the presidency. And this can be a very, very serious problem for us in Zimbabwe. Here's another issue that we must also tackle head on. The problems that have plagued our continent cannot always be attributed to old and senile leadership. Here are the facts. Jean Bedel Bokassa, the emperor of the Central African Republic, one of the most notorious dictators in Africa, he was 45 when he took over power. All right, let's go on. Joseph Kabila of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is 46. All right, let's go on. Charles Taylor of Liberia was 49 when he took over. Idi Amin was 48 when he took over. Paul Biya, who is still the president of the Cameroons today, was 47 when he took over in 1982. Sani Abacha of Nigeria was 47 when he took over. Sekou Toure of Guinea was 36 when he took over. The problem with all these guys was not their age. The problem with all these guys was lust for power. That was the problem. And you know what? They lasted for power even when they took over, and people didn't recognize that and got excited because change has come. And then they proceeded to do whatever they wanted when they were in power. And they became worse and worse, obviously, with old age. But it's a fallacy to think that simply because somebody is young, right, then they are actually not going to become a dictator. It's a fallacy. History proves us wrong when we think that way. We must think very hard as far as the people we elect, because what we see in their old age is simply something that is a reflection of, who they were when they were younger. In our own country, we had a very young cabinet at independence, and some people forget that we had a very young cabinet, or a young cabinet. Not say very young, but a young cabinet when we got our independence. And if you trace the lives of some of these men who ended up at the top, including President Mugabe, who was deposed, a few months ago, you will see that trait of lust for power. I was sharing with some people today that there is a narrative that is false, that is peddled by people, the narrative of our history as a country. So from 1980, President Robert Mugabe never stopped talking about wanting to establish a one-party state, which would be run according to Marxist-Leninist principles. And they never stopped doing what they needed to do to accomplish that, including making sure that power was centralized in the executive presidency. So the elimination of the office of prime minister and the consolidation of power in the office of the president was really a part of that, making sure that Robert Mugabe had all the power. These things didn't happen because he was in his 90s or because he married a young woman. He was always a person who wanted power. And you can look even at the history of the liberation struggle and some of the fights that he was involved in and prevailed, and you can tell, yeah, this man really wants to be on the top at all costs. So it's important for us to debunk this idea that simply because you elect someone young means you are going to safeguard your revolution, and the right things are going to happen, and you are going to have a constitutional democracy. We must look at every leader and ask ourselves this question: how committed is this leader to true democracy? How committed are they? Are we sure? And then we must ask the other question: do they have the capacity to deliver on the promises that they have made? And we really, really need to make sure of that. And then we must also find out, are the people that they've surrounded themselves with, because that is also an extension of the leader's capacity to produce the change that they promise. Are the people that surround them, are the people that come through the pipeline of their political party, are these the right people to actually produce the change that they've promised? This is really critical. There's one more thing that I'm going to talk about, and then I'll start addressing your questions. One of the most important things that we Zimbabweans have to recognize is that it's very easy for us to forget that the battle in the cities and so on, even if we win that battle in the cities, only benefits a small portion of our people. Over 70% of our people live in the rural areas. And if you go into the rural areas today, what you're going to find are people living in the 19th century today. And this is going to continue, and it's the story of many African countries. So there are certain things that people aggregate and people get excited. Or, our GDP is over there. This is the amount of GDP that we have and stuff like that. But the question that you must ask is how is the majority of the people living? Do they have access to some very, very basic things that they need to have? Do they have access to basic health? Do they? What is the reach of some basic life-saving interventions for children and pregnant mothers? What is the reach in the rural areas? Because really, if we look at Zimbabwe and we only judge the quality of life in Zimbabwe by what happens in the cities, we will have failed our people. Over 70% of our people live in the rural areas, and you must ask those who promise the things that they promise, what is your plan? What is your plan? And even right now, when you look at the electoral map, there's 150 rural constituencies, and there's only 60 in the urban centers. Now, what is the plan? What are we going to do to really impact the lives of people in the rural areas? What's the plan? What is the, give us the plan that will actually bring rural agriculture into the 21st century. Look, someone said this to me, and I really got offended when they said that, because there's this suggestion that, the people in Zimbabwe who live in the rural areas, they are happy. They're happy. They're happy with what they do not have. What I know, and every Zimbabwean, including the people who are in the diaspora, know this, because they get requests from their relatives, not just those who are living in the cities, but all those who are living in the rural areas, who can't make ends meet, who can't send their children to school. Some of them have actually sold all their cattle to pay this tuition for their children. Look, Zimbabweans deserve to live in the 21st century, even in the rural areas. And there has to be that commitment on the part of every leader that we elect. And it's not just about, we're going to reduce unemployment in the cities. No. We must ask ourselves this question, because, in this regard, I am very, very committed to making sure that when it comes to land, the people who need land in the rural areas really get it. Not these people who are just going to grab farms from people and not use them. No. The people who need land in the rural areas really need to get that land. Why is this important? Because when you look at a person's hierarchy of needs, a piece of land, a big enough piece of land, actually addresses some of those needs. Shelter, well, you can build a house on the land. Food, if you've got good land, then you can actually meet your needs. And that land can actually be the job that you need. But what we have to do is to make sure that there is an agricultural revolution even in the rural areas, so that these people who are living under the poverty datum line can actually live in the 21st century in the rural areas. And we must ask ourselves, what is the plan? What's the plan? What is the plan that we have for over 70% of our people who live in the rural areas? Because if we don't have that plan, we can promise whatever we promise, the condition of our country will continue being the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to address some of your questions. And again, let me just remind you where we started here. I said at the beginning, we have to be very, very careful to learn from history, because history shows us that we have a lot of promises that are made by people, and we get excited about those people, and we say they're going to bring us change simply because they excite us. And we never ask, do they have the capacity to actually bring about the change that they promise? And if we don't do that, we're in trouble. You and I know that to actually have a functioning democracy, here's what's needed. You need institutions that protect you from leaders. You need institutions that even protect you from the leader that you yourself vote for. You need institutions that do that. And you need people in those institutions that are not afraid of the leader that you are excited about when that leader goes wrong. If you don't have those institutions and people in those institutions that are not afraid, that will not be cowed because, oh my goodness, I can't do this. I can't go against my own party president. then you are never going to safeguard yourself against the excesses of leaders. It's critically important that you have those institutions and that you have those people who are not afraid to actually challenge those people who actually appointed them. Some of you have been following what has been happening in the United States. You have seen that President Trump, for instance, is being investigated by Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller is a person who was appointed by someone who is working under Trump, and he's actually investigating Trump. That's how a democracy should work. You should have people who are not afraid to actually take on the leaders who appointed them when they actually go rogue. And politicians go rogue. Power goes into people's heads. And once power goes into people's heads, then you have a problem. So, what is the commitment of the people that you're going to elect? To build institutions that will actually take them to task. What is the commitment of those people? To appoint people into those institutions who are not necessarily card-carrying members of their party. Are those people going to say, well, the commissioner of the police must be appointed not on the basis of the fact that he is the the person who has been in the party for the longest, but because he's the top law enforcement officer that we can find, so we make him the commissioner of the police, not because he's a card-carrying member of ZANU, not because he's a card-carrying member of any political party, but because he's the best. When are we going to appoint diplomats, for instance, who are well-trained, who know what is supposed to happen, who are not naive, who know that every nation acts in its own self-interest? And when they come to the president to give him advice, they can tell the president, they can tell the Minister of Foreign Affairs the truth and say, hey, listen, actually these people are not our friends. We must treat every nation exactly the same. These people work in their own self-interest. They are not necessarily our enemies, but we have to be astute enough to represent our own interests effectively. How are we going to have those people in the offices that they must be in, so that we can actually have the kind of leadership that will deliver on the change that it promises? And do not forget what I said concerning the dictators that have been in Africa for a very long time. It's a fallacy to say that some of those people only became dictators because they were senile and old. They were not. And I've given you the ages of all those people. You can go and research them yourself, and you can do all the Googling you want, and you're going to find that yes, Joseph Kabila indeed was 46. Fidel Bokassa was indeed 45 when he took over, and they were dictators. These guys are dictators right from the beginning. So let's not fool ourselves and think that age is the problem. No, it's the heart of the people that you elect. So let me tackle some of the questions. Someone asked and said, how are you going to revolutionize rural agriculture? And that's a very, very good question. How are you going to revolutionize Africa, the rural agriculture? Well, you know what? Everything starts with a commitment for us to funnel resources where they should go, and to actually create investment space. And I'm not talking, when I say investment space, I'm not just talking about people from outside, even local investment space, even in the rural communities. You must not forget that people who are in the rural areas are critical suppliers of things that we are in. We need. Food chain is not complete without those people in the rural areas producing what they produce. And beyond that, we actually have the capacity for some of these people to be producing things that we send for export. What we have not done is rationalize some of the collection things, some of the capitalization of rural agriculture. We have not done that. And the neglect of actually capitalizing that and rationalizing rural the supply chain and so on is something that is very, very critical, and it's something that every government has to be committed to. We have to be committed to actually bringing in even technology so that we can actually start smart agriculture. We also have to, I said in the last video that I did, that one of the things that we're going to do, just like we're going to do for provincial economies, we're going to have a business engagement team which focuses on looking for opportunities for the produce that comes from rural communities to actually be marketed outside the country. And we really need to do that. If we don't pay attention to that and we're only looking at industries in the urban areas, and we don't actually look at intentionally finding ways to market the produce of people in the rural communities, we are never going to revolutionize agriculture in there. And beyond that, I think it's important for us to really go back and see some of the things that worked before in terms of agricultural support services. And these are some of the things that need to be resuscitated. Agricultural support services are important for rural communities, and we need to reinstitute those. So yeah, that's one of the ways of actually making sure we begin to revolutionize rural agriculture. We make sure that we can find markets for rural produce. And you and I know that one of the things that happens in this country, which is really very sad, is that we actually have the second largest number of dams in Zimbabwe after South Africa. The entire region of Southern Africa, we actually have 12,000 dams. And most of these dams are actually used to water projects in commercial agricultural projects. So you'll find that here's a dam, for instance, and that dam actually bypasses a community and goes straight to a commercial initiative which is nearby. And one of the things that we must do is we must make sure that, and this is where we can also utilize the current traditional leaders and the structures that are there, the rural district councils and so on, so that we begin to rationalize the water distribution into villages. One of the interesting things is that our villages are not as irrationally placed as it would seem. We do actually have villages. We do actually have, traditional leaders and structures that can actually be utilized to rationalize the water distribution, to rationalize the whole distribution of assistance to rural communities. So this is really what we need to do. Instead of using chiefs as the defenders of those that are in power, we need to integrate that whole structure into the agricultural and rural development plan that we will unfold. So let me go to the next question. Mr. Masango says, what is your plan? We all know about these things you're talking about. Well, I'm glad you know these things. Other people don't, Mr. Masango. We have actually put out our manifesto. And if you're interested in knowing about the manifesto, you can go to our website and you will see our manifesto. And our manifesto lays out 10 plans, points that we have. And we have said these things over and over again. The fact that you haven't heard about them, maybe you just haven't been curious enough to find out about the things that were said we're going to do. But I can tell you some of the things that we're going to do, including devolving the presidency. We have said that a Build Zimbabwe Alliance president is going to be committed to being in a province one week out of the month. And that's going to be a working visit. That is to bring presidential attention to the needs that are there in that province. That is to attract, even investor attention, because where the president goes, then you attract that kind of attention to that province. And the president of Zimbabwe is not the president of Harare or the president of the metropolitan provinces. He is the president of every province in this country. And, we must translate that into actual action by devolving the presidency. We have said, which is another point in our 10-point plan, we will aggressively defend, promote and defend the rights of every citizen in this country. That is really, really important. And in a practical way, we're actually going to set up a division of civil rights in the Attorney General's office, which is supposed to defend the rights and freedoms of every Zimbabwean, even from government encroachment. That is something that is very, very practical. And it's something that cannot be done, obviously, without changing this whole environment where you have AIPA, where you have POSA and things like that. So these are laws that need to be repealed and repealed urgently. So that's one. And then we have said that in order for us to actually resuscitate the economy of Zimbabwe, we must do something to develop business engagement plans for each province. Again, consistent with what we said about the president actually going to every province and actually working in that province. And by the way, when he does, at the end of that week's visit, he must issue a state of the province address from that province so that the whole nation knows exactly what is going on in that province, so that next year, when he comes again to that province, we can clearly see whether progress has been made, whether the business engagement teams that have actually been appointed for that province have done their job, whether the investment that was supposed to come into that province actually came. Because it's high time we held all the people who claim that, so let me say this as it may seem as an aside, because this is one of the tragedies also of our country. There are people who celebrate the fact that government officials have gone somewhere and signed deals. Look, countries are not developed by these deals, because if you know anything about some of these deals, what you're going to find is that these deals are actually debts. You sign a deal and they give you money and you actually have to actually pay them back. So these are not things to celebrate. The question that you must ask is, has there been any transparency when it comes to these deals? What exactly is coming to us? What is the benefit to the people of Zimbabwe, of signing these deals? So this is one of the important things about actually making sure that you have the right people in government. But anyway, we have a 10-point plan. It's in our manifesto. You can take a look at it. You can go to www.buildzimbabwe.org and you find our 10-point plan there. You're also going to find we have put out a lot of stuff. We've put out a lot of videos. We've put out a lot of written things that actually outline our plan. We haven't hidden anything. So yeah, in answer to your question, what is your plan? We have put it out there, and if you look for it, you're going to find it. Let me tackle another one of the questions that have been sent to me. What progress is BZA making to increase visibility in the rural constituency, especially after this Zimba saga? Just to remind the people who are watching about the Zimba saga. So we were going to have a rally in Zimba, and we got our police clearance. And after we got our police clearance, when we showed up in Zimba, a letter had been written by the Justice Minister to the Rural District Council. And that letter said that no opposition party was allowed to have a rally in Zimba until August, until after the election, because ZANU-PF had booked every venue. ZANU-PF had booked every time slot in Zimba, and so no opposition party was allowed to do anything there. Anyway, we did go to Zimba. We defied what they had said, and we actually went into the communities and had our meetings. We didn't have the rally at Murombezi, but we actually did meet people. So I think one of the things that is important about that is that there is a very clear strategy by ZANU-PF. It may not be overt intimidation, but there are already some people who are the gatekeepers who make sure that it is difficult for people to go into these rural communities and actually canvass. Why is that something that is very, very important? It's very important because there's 150 rural constituencies and only 60 urban ones. And if they can successfully do that, maybe without beating people, but some of these guys who are in the rural district council, when they receive something like that from a minister, then they actually block people from doing what they're supposed to do. So to answer your question, we're not stopping. We're not stopping because of that. We are continuing to go into the rural communities, and you're going to find us there all the way through the election. And one of the things that we as the BZA are very committed to is doing things, quietly. We are very, very committed to making sure that we go where we need to go. We talk to the people that we need to talk to, who are the voters, and make sure that they can actually choose right when election time comes. Another question that I got is, what is your plan on the cash crisis? What is your plan on the cash crisis? So here's what I would like to remind us. How do you bring money into your economy? How does money flow into your economy? Because some people think that to resolve the cash crisis, and this is something that Gideon Gono did too well for us. You simply go in there and you print more money. But you and I know that is not the way to solve the problems in an economy. You solve the problems by increasing economic activity and creating attractive conditions for people to come into your money and into your country. And you actually make sure that people can trust you, your stewardship of the economy. I was really pleasantly surprised when I went to Zambia recently to see that their currency has held steady at 9 kwacha against the US dollar, and it's even stronger than the rand. It was very pleasantly surprised. Obviously, I wish it could be even stronger than that. But there's something going on in some of these countries. The leadership, is giving people confidence, in certain areas that we have failed. If you don't have the right people stewarding your economy, it's going to be impossible for capital to come in to your economy, because it's only the inflow of money and economic activity in your country that creates the liquidity that resolves the cash crisis. So one of the things that even us as Zimbabweans, we must watch out for. We must be very careful with some of these deals where government officials go out of the country and who knows who gives them what. And, they come back and they've got this slush fund and they say they're going to inject it into the economy and this is going to solve the cash crisis. That only does so temporarily, as you and I know. The real solution to the cash crisis is making sure that we have the right leadership that can be trusted, whose stewardship can be trusted by people. You have the right investment climate because people actually know that you respect the rule of law. They know that. And, they are confident that, property rights are going to be protected. They're confident in all of that. And unfortunately, and I must say this, I cannot make, just a false promise to you. What does it take to restore trust? Because the length of time that it takes to restore trust is what determines how soon you can resolve some of these people. And you know what? We are going to make sure that we are a government that people truly trust. We're going to make sure that we are transparent even during this election process. And in doing so, hope that people are going to see that we're very, very serious about creating the kind of environment where they can trust us with their money. Somebody asked and said, Fadzayi Mahere is running for MP. She has an HQ. Where is your HQ? I don't know what that means. You're talking about headquarters. Where is your HQ? We are actually, so our strategy, by the way, is absolutely different from, because what you are expecting from me is what you see in every political party. And fortunately, we refuse to be like all political parties. We work in the constituencies. Our HQs are where our candidates are. That's where our HQ is. Where the candidates are, where they are canvassing in their constituencies, that's our HQ. That's where we work from. And actually, by the way, those people who are in the executive of our party, those people who are officials in our party, know where our offices are. I'm not sure what the intent of that question is, but the fact that, and I'm not sure what the comparison is. So it is the fact that Fadzayi Mahere, who is running for MP, has an HQ. What does that? I'm not understanding what the comparison is. Having an HQ doesn't mean you're going to win an election. I certainly wish her well, but I don't understand what that has to do with actually providing the kind of leadership that we need. The people who are working in our party know where we meet. We meet in our offices, and they know where those offices are. So I'm going to tackle another one. Tatenda Membere asked about Gukura Hundi. What is your answer to the Gukura Hundi issue? I think this is something that I have addressed over and over again, and I will address it again today. One of the books that was written by, a man called Father Mkonori. Actually, I actually happen to have the book right here. Father Fidelis Mkonori, who was very, very instrumental in negotiating the transition of power, if you could call it that, wrote a book called The Genesis of Violence in Zimbabwe. It's a very interesting book. And he says some really powerful things in this book. And I encourage every Zimbabwean to read that book. One of the things that he said, and he even said this before Mugabe was removed from power, that if we as a nation do not address truthfully the things that happened in Gukura Hundi, we are going to be in trouble as a nation, because you can't wish these things away. And you and I know that lately there has been a commission which was appointed, and it has gone around the country. And in some places in Bulawayo, people are quite angry because when the perception is that the appointing authority for a commission which is supposed to address your pay is somehow tainted because they were part of it, then you have a problem. I don't know why we are afraid in this country to actually have people who are totally neutral participate in something like leading the reconciliation process. When you have a government like we have, and there are people in that government who really participated from a leadership perspective, and in what happened in Bulawayo. Look here, it's what do you expect? How do you cannot address the pain, the genuine pain of people that way? And as far as I'm concerned, we make it worse for ourselves. Government makes it worse for our relationships in this country, when there is no clear understanding that there needs to be a neutral body that actually deals with some of these sensitive issues. You can't dismiss the pain of people who went through what they went through. You cannot. And we talk sometimes about the what happened during the 2008 elections and the violence that were perpetrated against people. You know what? There was violence, and we accept that there was violence. And we've had meetings that have been organized to talk to allow the victims of political violence to actually express their opinions and so on. And a lot of those actually just address what happened in 2008. Well, there's a bigger issue in this country, and there's a deeper pain in this country that needs to be dealt with, and dealt with, in a way that is considerate of what the people went through. Now, if you're asking me about, things like reparations and so on, the unfortunate thing, the longer you take to honestly deal with someone's pain, the greater the demands the victim then starts making. And unfortunately, we as a country, I really believe, and in fact, the Mugabe government has not dealt in a timely fashion with the pain of any people that they have offended. And the cost to us as a nation continues to increase. And there comes a time when then every demand by people who have been aggrieved then becomes legitimate. And that is something that we have to understand. So a couple of more questions that I will address. What's your take and vision for the education sector, especially higher and tertiary system? How do we create an ecosystem of confidence and integrity in our high schools, examination boards, and universities? Tendi, I really thank you for this question, because this is a tough one. As you and I know, for the past 37 years, we have continued to churn out high school graduates, university graduates, college graduates for jobs that don't exist. Part of our problem is also because we as Zimbabweans really value education. And as you know, people would rather go without a roof over their heads. They'll sell their houses to actually fund their children's education. And it's something that's very, very important to us as a people. And unfortunately, we have not had in this last 37 years an opportunity to really ask ourselves the question: what should the 21st century educational system look like? What's the syllabus for that? What kind of graduates are we supposed to be producing? Everything is disjointed, and this is what happens when you have the kind of problems that we have had in our country. We never then have the actual opportunity to sit down as a people and figure out what is good for us. I've said this, there is a national conversation that must be had. And that national conversation must not just be had in an exclusive leadership club. It's a conversation that must be had in a broader setting, really talking to the Zimbabwean people and bringing in ideas from other Zimbabweans who are in other places, who are leaders of educational institutions in new economies, and figuring out, so what is the education that we need? You don't just, to a certain extent, when you talk about elementary school education, there's basic education that you want to give everybody so that people are literate. And then when you start going higher to secondary and post-secondary education, now you're educating people so that they can be in jobs, so that they can feed their families, so that they can have careers. So that's different from the elementary education that everybody needs to have. You are actually educating people now so that they can feed their families. And so there has to be a connection between the kind of economy that you're building and the kind of educational system that's there to support that economy. And that's not an easy conversation to have. In some places, what I have also found, and I actually happened to be privy to some of these conversations with senior education leaders in the United States, where there's actually a de-emphasis on some courses so that people can actually go to technical colleges or be equipped with actual skills like plumbing and so on and so on. When you tell people that, they freak out. They say, well, you know what, you're saying that because you have a university degree and you don't want me to go to university and so on. But look, we must ask ourselves, what is the purpose of education? And then we must craft our education strategy from the answer that we're going to get. What is the purpose of so if somebody is a graduate, I see here Stephen Gift Machena says, Doc, I'm a graduate, quantity surveying graduate. It really pains me, that I have lost students who are working at my site as general hands. What's your message to them? And you know what, this exactly addresses what I'm talking about, because we are churning out university graduates even in areas that we don't need. Some of you may not be familiar with this, but in 1980, or 80, I think it was 80 or 81, there was a manpower planning survey which was done, so that our investment in education and developing our people would actually address the gaps that we had. And I remember Ibo Mandaza was involved with that. It was actually under the Ministry of Labor, Manpower Planning and Development. And it was something that was really laudable that the government did that, that they actually did a manpower planning survey. But along the way, something happened, and whatever plans we had as a country ended up not being implemented the way that they should. But you should have a manpower planning survey. That's something that should be revisited. You start with a manpower planning survey. In that manpower planning survey, you are trying to determine what are the skills that you need for a 21st century economy, and specifically for your economy, because each economy has its own unique things. When you do that manpower planning survey, and it's something that I would advocate we do immediately, do that manpower planning survey, and then what you do, you craft your educational approach based on the results of that manpower planning survey. If you just sit there as Minister of Education and just say, well, we are going to change this or we're going to change that, you end up in the problems that we have been in the country. Yeah, so Stephen, my message to those law students, unfortunately, in the time in which we're living, it's important sometimes for people to retool. It's not an easy thing, to actually retool and, sometimes go back to school and actually train in a different areas. How many lawyers can a country have? How many lawyers, really? How many? And we must ask ourselves that question. And when we build another law school in this country and so on, we must ask, what are the needs that we truly have for the law profession in this country? And if we don't address that, we are in trouble. All right, let me answer a couple more questions because it's already 3 minutes after 8. I know we started a little after 7, so we'll go a little bit over. What is your plan on corruption? So this is actually a very, very big problem. One that is not easily dealt with, but one that must. I intimated earlier that one of the biggest problems that there is that, for instance, leaders appoint people to be in the civil service, and these people see their job purely as protecting the interests of the people who appointed them. Because they belong to the same political party and so on, and no one ever asked them any question about non-performance, and nobody really asked any question about corruption. Actually, it's hard for people who are above them to ask about corruption, because in a situation such as we have, where there are money problems, inefficiencies are actually intentionally created by people in the bureaucracy so that they can create opportunities for bribes and facilitation fees. And when this happens, that money goes to the civil servant who creates those inefficiencies, but I bet you it also finds its way up to the appointing authority. So, corruption is something that is very, very difficult to address unless you are truly, truly committed to it. You have to be committed to really addressing, corruption and taking it head on. But you can't do it alone. So one of the reasons why we say you have to have top to bottom leadership renewal is because it's not just the president who should be committed to the fight against corruption. Ministers must be committed to the fight against corruption. Civil servants must be committed to the fight against corruption. The commissioner of the police must be committed to fight against corruption. So you guys remember what used to happen. Things have changed a little bit now. You see the policemen had the few roadblocks that are mounted there, and they are like toothless dogs now, and so on. But the harassment that we went through, and you and I know that this was an instruction from above. They were making money. They actually had quotas to fill. So all the corruption that was going on at roadblocks and so on, the people who were up there knew about it, and in fact, you gave the orders that these people who are under there need to actually fill their quotas. So, unless you have, like I said before, if you don't have, institutions, intentionally create institutions that can even fight against the excesses of the people who appoint these lower level people, then you are not going to deal with corruption. And so it's going to take all that leadership, top to bottom leadership renewal. It's going to take, making sure that the people who are appointed are not just party functionaries and loyalists, but people who are truly committed to making sure that things are done right. It's also going to take rationalizing our compensation processes so that, people are justly paid for the work that they do. You don't create a temptation for people to use their job to earn money illegally. But what you do is you make sure that you justly compensate people. And when you do, then you can actually descend on them if they are actually involved in corruption. So it's not an easy thing. It's something that we should all fight. We must remember, here's the thing that is actually interesting. When it comes to corruption, if you actually have a dysfunctional economy, now I know that even in the first world, there's a lot of corruption that goes on, and sometimes they give it some really fancy names, you know. So they call it white collar crime, you know, when a crime is a sophisticated crime that is perpetrated by someone who is a corporate person, they call it white collar crime. There's a lot of you know, corruption even in the first world, you know. So you know, getting rid of corruption through development is a pipe dream. Corruption is actually intentionally dealt with by people who actually in their value system say this is wrong. So you have to elect people who in their value system say this is wrong. So another thing that I pointed out earlier, you know, there was a lot of excitement when Frederick Chiluba ran for office. And when he ran for office, there was a lot of hope. It was also a lot of hope because he was a man of faith. That he would do the right thing and all of that. You know that Chiluba ended up actually in prison because of some of the things that he did during the presidency. Here is what I say. It's important for us to have institutions that function regardless of the presidency or whatever. You know, you have institutions that function, that ensure that everyone is held accountable. It's also important for you and I, as citizens, to commit against the fight against corruption, because who feeds corruption? It's the citizens also, they feed it, you know. So it's important for us, all of us, to actually say this is our value system. We don't, you know, we don't want corruption, and we're going to fight it with everything that we have. I want to thank you. Let me. Okay, actually, before I do, let me say to Tatenda, he says he has not gotten a response from me. I'm not sure which question Tatenda Membere had sent. And Tatenda, if you can resend that question, I will address it as the last question on this broadcast. Which question, Tatenda? I'm really sorry that you have not gotten a response from me, but I'm not sure which question. You know, we might have just missed the question. Can you tell me which question that is, and I will address that question. Let me also check. Let me check one before I leave. Okay, I haven't gotten the question from Tatenda. I hear that he says he has sent messages before today. Tatenda, what happens with the messages that we are sent? We're going to go back, and I'm going to ask those people on our staff to actually look out for that message, because if you send that message to the Build Zimbabwe Alliance page, we will look for it, and we will do our best to respond. You know, soon after this broadcast, I'll just ask people to look for a question from Tatenda Membere, and you know, we will answer that. Just in case it has also been buried, Tatenda, we get a lot of questions from people every day, and sometimes we miss a question. It's not our intention not to actually address questions. If you could actually resend it so that we can see it, so that we don't have to go back to look for it, and we will will actually do that. So Tatenda Membere, okay, I see there. Yeah, so please, if you could resend that question, we will address it. We will absolutely address it. So I want to thank you. Okay, Mr. Oron, that is, might be willing. Okay, yeah, I'm as accessible as I can be. Someone was asking about accessibility. You can imagine what my challenge is. Sometimes my challenge is that there are so many people who actually reach out, and it's difficult for me to answer everyone. I really try to do that, but it's not always possible. And please bear with us because it's just sometimes not practical, because sometimes you can get 2,000 messages on WhatsApp and on Facebook, and just making sure that we can address all of that is actually not that easy. So please bear with us, and know that we actually do try our best to be accessible. It's just not possible to address everyone. So we try our best. So let me just summarize what we talked about today. I think it's critical that we really kind of rehash this just a little bit to remind ourselves. So the history of most African countries since the beginning of the decolonization process over 50 years ago is that we get so charged up and so excited, and we elect leaders who have the capacity to excite us, but we don't really look at their capacity to deliver on their promises. And 2018 is a critical time for us. We can't afford that. And there are some other people as well who kind of like imply that they talk a lot about this generational change and stuff like that. Just so you know, the average age of the people in our executive is in their 40s. And but again, as I said earlier, that really doesn't mean anything if these leaders are not committed to doing the right thing. You can again go back and look at the history of Africa. The worst dictators in Africa were in their 40s when they took over. That's crazy. They did not start being dictators when they were senile. They started then. And it's important for us to really address some of these things. We need to elect the right leaders. And you know what? It may happen that the right leader is in their 60s, in their 40s, is in their 50s. It really doesn't matter. You need to take a hard look at the leaders that we elect, because it's really for your future and mine and the future of our children. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for spending this hour with me. And, as we go on, we will do what we can technically to make this interactive, but thank you so much for spending this time with me. And as we always say, we put our right hand on our heart, and, we make this declaration that Zimbabwe, ilizwe lethu, ilifa lethu. This is our country, this is our heritage. Zimbabwe, nyika yedu, naka yedu. Zimbabwe, our country, our heritage. Thank you so much. Good night, wherever you are, and we will see you soon.